All right. Good evening, everybody. Good evening and welcome to Community Conversations. Tonight's panel is brought to you by the Hamilton Think Tank. Hamilton Think Tank and Walton Advisory Board meet to come up with these panel ideas. So if you're interested, you can contact Kevin Hatfield and he can help you out with some more of that information. Tonight's panel is called The F Word, Reassessing Feminism in the Third Wave. And our panelists today consist of Professor Naomi Zak, and she is a professor in the Department of Philosophy, and also the author of the book Inclusive Feminism, A Third Wave Theory of Women's Commonality. And we have Marcus Farley, who's the director of the U of O Men's Center. Now, before we get started with tonight's panel, I'd like to let you guys know we will be giving away a copy of Professor Zak's book, a signed copy, as a door prize. So Kevin will be handing out sheets of paper to sign up for the door prize. And he'll also be handing out a copy of a bibliography for tonight's panel, which the U of O Library has put together for us. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the mics over to the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a handout that I was going to talk from, and it might be good if people in the audience had a copy as well, so you have a sense of where we are at any given time. Is this mic on? Oh, it's for the camera. Well, that's confusing, right? You have sound for the camera. I want to thank you for being here. It's week 7, spring, lovely weather. And I know you could have been almost anywhere else, but you chose to be here, and I do appreciate it. What I would like to do is stimulate a discussion about some of the current issues in feminism. And in order to do that, I want to start with this very quick summary of how we've gotten to certain problems as feminists and also as women who may not consider themselves feminists. So this is just purely to refresh your memory. Academic feminists like to talk about 3 waves of feminism. And the first wave, and each wave, and I think this is probably characteristic of an academic, each wave tends to be categorized by certain books. So the first wave, the hallmark of the first wave, which really extended from the eve of the French Revolution in 1789 until 1920, when women got the vote in the United States, there are 2 books that really characterize the first wave. One was Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women, which she wrote in response to the Vindication of the Rights of Men, which was the rallying cry for the French Revolution. And the second book that was very important was published a couple of generations after Wollstonecraft, and it was called The Subjection of Women by the philosopher and essayist John Stuart Mill. What's interesting about both of these books is essentially they make the same argument. They argue in favor of equality for women, and both Mill and Mary Wollstonecraft were writing at a time when women could not own property, women could not vote. If women made money as wives, their husbands got their earnings. Women had no rights to child custody in the event of a divorce. In a sense, women were not functional as persons. And both John Stuart Mill and Mary Wollstonecraft offered meticulous arguments for the civic equality of women. In other words, women should have the vote, women should be able to keep their earnings and own property on the grounds. Well, there are two grounds. One is that they constitute half of the human race, and it's a colossal waste if you're not drawing on the talents of the other 50%. And the other ground was that they would make better wives and mothers if they were educated. Education was another a big component of the equality that both Mary Wollstonecraft and John Stuart Mill were striving for. But the argument was not women need these freedoms in their own right to determine their own destiny. It was we accept the fact that women, the highest calling of women, is to be wives and mothers, and they'll be better wives and mothers. They'll be better able to get their children started. They'll be more interesting companions for their husbands, but it did not go beyond that. So this this first wave of feminism culminated in 1918 in Great Britain, and we're just talking about the Western countries, and you may want to say something about that during discussion. Great Britain in 1918, the United States in 1920, when women got the right to vote. So women had the right to vote for about 30-odd years, and then there were two more books which ushered in what's commonly taken to be the second wave of feminism, and this was Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex and Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. And in The Second Sex, Simone de Beauvoir argued that in every society, women were more or less second-class citizens compared to men, and that it was nothing inherent about their biology that made them this. It was the way societies were set up. So her famous summarization of this condition, of this general condition of women, is women are not born but made. One is not born a woman, one becomes a woman as a result of living in a society which assigns certain roles. Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, was less of a comprehensive scholarly account of the lives of women over history and in many different societies, and it spoke more to the condition of middle-class American women. And her complaint was that middle-class American women had bought into ideals of femininity, and the result was that they were more or less imprisoned in their homes as housewives. And she argued that the job of being a 20th century wife, even in an affluent situation, wife and mother, was not enough to occupy the mind and the energy of an adult human being. So this was sort of a cry for women to get out of the house. Now, what's happened since the late 50s, when Simone de Beauvoir and Betty Friedan's books came out, is that women have achieved equal access. So more women graduate from college than men in the United States and in many other industrialized countries. Virtually every career opportunity and many sports opportunities that didn't exist before are open to women. Women seem to have a choice. And I think many young women of the age of people in this audience might wonder, well, okay, so we have the vote. You know, we're grateful for all of these courageous people who secured the vote and who secured equal access. You know, we're not going to be denied a job or a certain kind of education, a certain kind of career because we're women. But so, why do we need feminism? You know, and to some extent there's been a certain amount of backlash against feminism as unnecessary, somehow an elitist preoccupation of women in academia, a divisive in terms of family life, because in the last 10 or 15 years there's been a renaissance of family values, traditional family values. And also there's a sort of suggestion that feminism might interfere with the normal social functioning of women in society, that it kind of might impede whatever it takes for them to express themselves as women. And you see a certain amount of this in pop culture, which in some dimensions has gone back not toward an androgynous ideal, a sort of unisex ideal, which I think was dominant in the through much of the 70s, but almost to an ultra-feminine ideals for women. Okay, so why do we need feminism? Well, let's hold that in place as one question, and let me get back to that question toward the end of the problems which I think still face women. I want to start out by talking about further attacks on feminism. Now, at a certain point, when feminism became at least a recognizable, if not a completely legitimate academic subject, there was criticism that the feminists were all white, middle-class, privileged women, and they didn't speak for women of different races, different ethnicities, or different social classes. They didn't speak for poor women, and they didn't speak for women of color. And as a result of this, in the social sciences and in certain activist dimensions, women of color and poor women have talked about the ways in which they have different problems than white privileged women, and it's been argued that if you add race and class, you come up with gender. So the result of this is that many Latina women and African American women and Native American women and women of other racial and ethnic groups have actually argued that they have a different gender, that their gender is not the same. And this seems like quite a radical claim, but this has struck to the heart of the possibility of a united feminism. So the equation there is race plus class is equal to gender. Now, the third thing is that some writers claim that there's no such thing as women, and that the group of women, because of all the different races and different classes and different ages and different degrees of ableness and different sexual preferences and, you know, myriad different religions, different nationalities, that the group is just too diverse to collect under one term, and you can't define what a woman is. You know, there are just too many variations. So that is supposed to be a problem with feminism. Now, these first three problems, that feminism has been dominated by white privileged women, that women of color and poor women have different problems and may have different genders, and the claim that there's no such thing as women in a unified way, given the great diversity among the group of women. In a sense, these are all theoretical problems. I mean, these are problems that the scholars argue out among themselves. But there's a fourth problem, which is not merely a theoretical problem. It's a problem or a set of problems that affect everyone, even if they've never heard of the word feminism. And what this problem amounts to is despite equal access in employment, there are two unique problems that women encounter. The first is what's been called a glass ceiling. In the major economic, political, social institutions of the richest countries in the world, and also the poorest countries and the countries in the middle, women have occupy very small numbers proportionate to their numbers in the population. Very few female CEOs, very few female heads of state. Probably the number of female college presidents is rising. I don't know what the statistics are in that. It's probably still predominantly male. So the leadership, there are women in the military, but the leadership is still overwhelmingly male. So this means that women can rise to a certain level of success, and then something sort of invisible, glass ceiling, keeps them from getting to the very top. There does not seem to be equal access to the top. That's one thing. The second thing is, and feminists and feminist audiences that I've talked to about this have varying reactions to what I'm going to say, but I think the best way to describe it is as follows. There is a second shift, and women have chosen, in addition with their other forms of access, they have chosen to work a second shift. Now, what do I mean by this? I mean that most women college age, if you ask them, do you expect to work in your life? Do you expect to support yourself? Do you expect to bring money in to support your family? Do you expect to have a career? The answer would be yes. The majority of educated women would say yes, of course. They're going to have full work lives. But if you also ask them, well, do you expect to have a family? And this is something that cuts across sexual preference. Do you expect to have a family? Do you expect to have a home? Do you expect to have an intimate group of people around you for whom you play a special role? The answer will also be yes. Now, notice we live in a society where people get paid for their work outside the home, but they don't get paid for their work inside the home. And this is the problem of the second shift. And it's not a simple problem of money. Because think about it, if you began to pay women for women's work, and women's work consists of certain amount of physical labor, certain amount of emotional work, nurturing relationships between people, among people, keeping up with people, being a mother, which is work. I mean, it's not play. You don't play at being a mother. It's something very serious. It's work. housekeeping on various levels. All these things are work. All these things are women's work. But some of them, even though women do it for nothing, and it's a double stress, they choose it. They don't have to. Women don't have to get married anymore in order to support themselves, but they choose to do that. They choose to have families. The point is that paying women for this women's work is not going to solve the problem. And the reason it's not going to solve the problem is because then that would commodify things that we don't want to put a price on, like, for example, motherhood. So what's the solution? All right. I think that, well, I offer in my book solutions to, of course, you know, I'm a philosopher, I offer solutions to all of these problems. So let me just systematically tell you what my solutions are to the three major problems. The one having to do with unifying women in some way, given all the diversity. Second problem of the second shift. Third problem is actually the glass ceiling problem, but on a much bigger level. It's on the level in which women are not yet the full equals of men on the historical stage. You know, history is still mostly about big events in which men play central roles. Okay, so here are three solutions to those problems. Asking your patience in advance for the arrogance of a philosopher. First of all, I think we can define women. I think we can define women in the following way. We can define them as those human beings who are assigned to or identify with a group of human beings that consists of people designated female from birth, biological mothers, or heterosexual choices of men. This is the group that historically has made feminism necessary. Is it biologically determined? Partly, but not completely. Is it socially constructed? Partly, but not completely. Does it exist in all societies? The answer is yes. In all societies and in all recorded history, you can define women as not people who are either mothers or men's heterosexual choices or biological or female birth designees. I'm not saying you have to be any one of those things, although most women are at least one, but you don't have to be one. You just have to be associated with the group. So what I'm suggesting that women have in common is a relation to an historical group. And that group is the group of human beings who are birth females or biological mothers or men's heterosexual choices. Does that mean that women can be lesbians? Yes. Does that mean that women need not have been born female? Yes. They could be male to female transsexuals and still identify with the group. Does that mean that they have to have children? No. But even women who don't have children would still identify as women, where that's what's loosely meant or broadly meant by being a woman. And the reason I think it's important to have some kind of a definition like this, it's sort of an empty formal definition. It's nothing in a woman. It's not the special X chromosome or anything like that that makes her a woman. It's the association with this group. The reason it's important to have it is for the sake of the ways in which that group might actually offer some real promise in changing certain things in the world. I mean, the immediate reason for being able to give an idea of a unity of women is to cut through all the differences temporarily for strategic purposes of race and class and age and ableness and nationality and religion and everything else, in order for not only women to achieve full historical equality with men, but also for certain benefits that this could bring about. Because I think in addition to lingering problems with gender, the whole of the human species has an immediate problem about where we're headed now. I mean, what is going to happen to the planet, what is going to happen to various infrastructure programs, how many more wars can we sustain and still maintain a certain level of civilization, so on and so forth. There are many reasons to be very unhappy with the way men have run the world so far. So once you identify this neglected group, the group of women, my third suggestion is that that actually we should think very seriously about in democratic countries, electing women as heads of state, where women are traditionally understood not as androgynous persons who speak for all humanity, because there the temptation is too great to play the same game of war and the exploitation of natural environments that men easily play as really as part of the construction of their male identity and their masculinity. But the idea is that women, as they've been traditionally defined, might have something very different to bring to these top positions of leadership. So I think that given the historical contingency of how males and females have been differently defined in almost all human societies, we're left in a very interesting situation where women at this point in our human history might actually make better leaders. So that's basically, that's a book on a page, and and I welcome, comments and discussions.
Well, that was excellent. And I'm not going to try to add to that as much as to offer, I guess, a little bit of why I'm sitting up here as well. My name is Marcus Farley. I'm the director of the UO Men's Center and a graduate student in the Marriage and Family Therapy program. And in a real simplistic sense, I love the idea that men have had their chance to lead. And I love that notion, and there's much more to that. In terms of what I wanted to bring to the table here is the impact of both second wave and third wave feminism on men. And a lot of what has been out there has been the backlash of the 1980s, the Rush Limbaugh, the Reagan era. Reagan was not a very good feminist. So that's a lot of what has gotten press, is the impact on men, or more men's backlash and attempt to have an impact on feminism. I'd like to suggest just a few things that men also owe to the movement of feminism, both in the second wave and in the current third wave, and what's happening.
Could I ask you just a question?
Absolutely.
What is the men's center? I think it's great that there's a men's center, but it's the first I've heard of it.
That's wonderful. Has anyone else not heard of the Men's Center? All right. Well, we're starting to, that's okay. That's okay. Well, the Men's Center is, we've been here for 5 years. We were mostly formed because of research in the late 1990s on campus and throughout the country that showed that men were underutilizing every service available for supports. Disability services, academic services, counseling services, health services. Men just weren't going for help. And what the end result of that was that 70 to 85% of conduct code violations were caused by men. Men were causing almost all of the violence to women and to other men on campus. They were 6 times more likely at college age as of the year 2000 to commit suicide successfully. Alcohol and drug problems were much higher. So the research showed that men were in crisis. They were harming themselves, they were harming women, they were harming each other, but weren't going for help. So that's where we mostly emerged from, was trying to raise help-seeking behaviors and help, in a nutshell, help men realize that real men are realistic men, that they do go and seek help when they need it rather than saying, I'm not lost. So it's kind of a campy way of saying it, but that's
it's really interesting.
part of that too, is that we involve ourselves in social justice issues, and we work with Sexual Violence Awareness Week and Domestic Violence Awareness Month every October. We work with Sexual Assault Support Services in women's space, LGBTQA, and try to get men more involved in these issues and become more active, rather than acting like all of these are women's issues to work with. But the impact of feminism, second wave feminism, one of the things that it really provided for men, when you look back in the 1980s, when the second wave apparently started to crumble during the Reagan era, you have a lot of backlash. It's really real apparent with Clarence Thomas and everything else that was going on during that time. And what doesn't get as much press is the very first book ever published for male survivors of incest was published in 1987 by a man named Mike Lew. The concept that men could be victimized by sexual abuse had never been addressed in print before. But in the wake of these ideas of social constructionism and the idea that maybe gender is really something that we're predominantly making up, it gave men the opportunity to start to question the rules, the unwritten rules of what it meant to be a man. And in doing so, one of the unwritten rules is men are not victims. It gave men the opportunity to start opening to that possibility, which then led to books in print, which also led to, throughout the 90s, altar boys coming out and finally starting to speak up about things that they had experienced when they were children. Well, this revolutionized a lot of people's concepts of what it meant to be a man, because suddenly there were men, including Mark McGwire, who was at the time at the height of his baseball career, was the big home run champion, big burly guy, and he got up in front of the press and started a foundation to prevent child sexual abuse and acknowledged that he was a sex abuse survivor. And this 20 years before would have been even more radical, but even at the time really shocked a lot of people to see a man of his stature and manliness, so to speak, get up and speak about these issues so openly. And it started to redefine courage, I think, within the male population, because suddenly courage became the ability or the courage to stand up, and even though it's scary, to stand up and start embracing the idea that maybe there's more to being a man than what the rules, the box that we were all trying to live within. So it opened up a conversation, essentially. And the third wave of feminism, you know, I obviously don't have an understanding of it the way that Professor Zach does. My understanding of third wave feminism is being limited, I'll just say that. Essentially, in my mind, is the biggest critique that I've read about it is that it doesn't have a central issue that it's latching onto, like second and first wave feminism, that it's ambiguous and scattered, that it's a little bit too individual and stylized. My feeling in reading everything that I've studied about it, which again is limited, but my feeling about it is that really there is a central issue, and it's the whole concept of division in the first place. It's all of this fragmenting. It's finally an opportunity to address the idea that this fragmenting is something that we are constructing and perpetuating by believing in it. And the more we believe in it, the more we behave. All behavior is communication, so we're communicating with each other and helping to reestablish the rules by trying to live up to them.
Could I just say something about?
Absolutely.
I mean, I think Marcus is absolutely right about the fragmentation of third wave feminism, but in a way, what it represents is feminism having stalled. And the reason, but there are reasons why feminism fragmented in the way that it did, and that is that at a certain point, identities became the mechanism for progressive social change. So people became very attached to whatever their identity, whether identities of race, identities of sexual preference, identities of you know, whether they're male or female, all of these different, and there's a huge multiplicity of identities. I mean, regional identities, class identities, professional identities, and all of these different identities compete, you know, for entitlements and for social justice. And one of the things that tends to happen when I mean, it's good to have diversity. I mean diversity in the sense of the literal sense of all kinds of differences of people asserting what they want on the basis of how they see themselves. This is all a very healthy thing. But one of the phenomena in progressive movements is that as soon as you have different identities, they start fighting with each other. So the it's not a kind of a lack of knowing what the goal is. There are many, many different goals, and they haven't really been prioritized. Do you see what I'm saying? I
Absolutely.
mean, so that's a fragmentation. So it's not just the label, you know. I mean, the label stands for things that are very important to specific people. I mean, if the LGBT community has goals that are very important to individuals who identify among different groups in that community. It's not that they can just put that aside. That's the thing that it's necessary to get across. Hispanics from all of the different countries that qualify for an Hispanic identity, African Americans, I mean Native Americans, all of the different regions and tribes. I mean, every one of these groups has its own legitimate claim for what it needs to get to the next step that they think is the most important thing in the world. So the question is, how do you allow people to have that self-expression and then also come together on some common basis? That's the real issue. And feminism, you know, in a way, feminism is a lot like the Democratic Party. I think the Democratic Party sort of fell about, you know, people complain about the Democrats that they don't seem to have issues. You know, they don't seem to be united. They don't seem to have strong leadership. And I mean, I haven't done a study of the Democratic Party, but it might be a similar phenomenon that you have all of these different splintered groups that just can't find something to unite on.
Well,
So, you know.
I absolutely. I think that to me, that's what's so inspiring to me about what I have seen emerging in third wave feminism in the literature, and what I think has had a positive impact on men and their development as well, is this notion that the next step is to move from either or into both and recognize that yes, there are, you know, about 6 billion different ways to be a human being. There are about 3 billion different ways to be a man, and recognizing that it's all about it's about both and recognizing that those issues are one and the same.
I know, but how do you do that? Because, I mean, it's not, you know, you can do it, you can say the words, but how do you do it? I mean, I don't think anybody knows how to do it.
No, I
Right,
agree.
okay.
I absolutely agree.
I mean,
I think that the big gift that I'm speaking to is the idea that this conversation now is happening, which feels like a step in the direction. It feels like men are starting to become more actively involved in this and other conversations like it, which under a lot of second wave feminism, it was definitely a lot less, men were a lot more inhibited about stepping
That's
into
right.
these conversations.
women were more separatist in second wave feminism, but here's an interesting phenomenon. The women have gained access in a kind of androgynous workspace, and it's a good strategy to be androgynous in the workspace because you just get more work done than if you bring your full-blown sexual role into the workspace. But men in our society have not become more androgynous. Men have actually become more masculine. So we go back to an older system. It's almost like a one-sex system, which was, you know, people believed there was just one human sex until about the 18th century. They just thought that women were imperfect versions of men. You know, they were colder and damper and less strong and not as smart. But basically there's one sex, and females are a sort of imperfect form of it. This idea goes back to Aristotle. Well, in a way, you have that. I mean, you have a kind of hyper-masculinity on the highest levels of power. And you have women participating, but the women don't participate in an historical sense as women. The women sort of participate androgynously, which is to say they don't really assert a gender identity, except it's a paler form. It's a muted form of the hyper-masculine identity. So, I mean, in other words, I have a sense that Marcus is being a counselor, it's a good thing, especially if you're dealing with a population that's more likely to commit suicide. He's optimistic. But, you know, I mean, I think it's a good thing. You know, I like optimism. But I think that you're only going to get, I think one way to make some traction in this situation is not to be optimistic, but to be pessimistic for a while. I mean, so to really look at some of the enormous problems that we have and then maybe move. I mean, do you know what I'm saying? I value the optimism, but we don't want to deny some horrendous divisions and problems that we have. So I'm not so sure. You know, I have a friend, a colleague, his name is Tom Digby, and he wrote a book called Men Doing Feminism. He didn't write it, it's an edited anthology. It's called Men Doing Feminism. And Tom thinks that things are getting better. You know, men are getting more sensitive. They're realizing the cost, the tremendous cost of this traditional masculinity, cost in terms of obligation, cost in terms of risk to life in times of war. Men are more likely to be, not exclusively, more likely to be in the military than women. Physical harm, I mean, all kinds of being shut down emotionally. He thinks that men are coming to realize the cost of that, which is sort of what you were saying, that they, you know, it's hard to get them to ask for help, and that things are getting better. I don't think that things are getting better. I think things are pretty much the same to worse. I think things are getting worse. Which I think is a constructive. I'm saying this constructively because I don't think that we're at the point where we're going to gain anything if we think things are getting better.
Well, I'm not sure. I feel like it happens on different levels of abstraction, so I would absolutely agree with you on a socio-political level that things are absolutely worse. I'm about to hit my 40th birthday, and things are a whole lot worse now than when I was a kid. So I think that I absolutely agree with you. And on a different level of abstraction, aside from what I read in the papers, see on TV, or watch on the news, the men and women and people of all genders that I do interact with, both as within the community, as a single father living out in the community, as a student here on campus, the men that I interact with that are coming through the programs that the Men's Center offers, that are discussion programs gearing men towards starting to open up towards the impact of socialization and what that's done for their lives. What I do see is that change is happening on that level. And, for example, I'll draw from personal rather than drawing from elsewhere. I've been studying feminism myself, not to claim that makes me an expert or anything. Since the early 1990s, it's been a fascination of mine, mostly as a survivor of abuse myself. That's what got me into studying feminism in the first place. When I decided in the year 1997 to become a parent, and my daughter was born, we went through, my ex-partner and I went through and studied all of the different preconceptions about what it meant to be a mother and what it meant to be a father. And we tried to break them down. And I was afforded an opportunity in the process to experience things that I don't think many men get to. And the example that I'll use would be nursing. That for the first 3.5 years of her life, she would nurse at night. But the routine we had, and there is no always or never, but the routine we had in place most of the time was that when she would nurse our daughter to the point where she was almost asleep and stop, and she would actually fall asleep laying on my chest. So nursing to my daughter was something that both mom and dad did. And dad was just as involved in the physical nurturing process of nursing her to bed at the end of every day. So that was an opportunity I was afforded. I'm working as a director of Men's Center in a metaphorical sense to provide opportunities like that to other men. So I see in little ways men getting involved in types of work like this that 10, 15, 20 years ago would never even been seen as opportunities. The literature's starting to catch up. It's starting to be written more and more. I absolutely agree with you that things are getting worse on this level. And I have to believe, in order to keep doing what I'm doing, that things are getting better on an interpersonal level. And if that's false, and I'm sure it is on some days.
I think things are getting better for the people for whom they're getting better. But if you look at the whole picture, is our situation better? Is our situation improving? Things are better for women. You can do more, but you also have to do more. I mean, it's almost impossible when you talk to women in full stride of having careers and babies, and partners. It's almost a superhuman job to do all these things at the same time, and yet we don't think anything of it. This somehow is a privilege. The other, the more cynical reason why so many women are in the workplace is that during the time in which women entered institutions of higher education and the workplace, there was a profound change in the American economy. We made a shift from being a producing economy to being a service economy, and now we're more of a financial outsourcing economy. So what that meant in terms of the gross national product is a lot of hidden inflation. In other words, the average middle-class family does not have what the average middle-class family had 30 years ago, and in order to come close to having it, both people have to work. Now, it used to be the case that industrious working-class families could survive, imagine this, on the wages of just one person. One person could go out and have a job with one of these old-time American corporations or be a member of a craft guild, working people, not even people with college degrees, and make enough money to support a family, to have a house, to have pensions, and maybe to send 1 or 2 kids to college. I mean, This now requires what's considered upper middle class status in order to achieve, to have the house, to send the kids to college, to have some leisure time, and to have a pension. So the economy has shifted. We're less, as a society, we're less productive. It's not that people don't work as hard. It's that in the global economy, our labor isn't worth as much. And therefore, it takes two people in a household to go out and work to get the same standard of living that one person could bring in before. So this has been happening while women have also been having all these greater opportunities. And women still want to do the family work, which I think is you know, that's fine. I mean, you can't, everybody wants to have a family. I mean, that's not something that needs to be critiqued. But the system is, it's a very strained system.
I absolutely agree, and I also think that having worked in Eugene for quite some time with running fathers groups through the university and out in the community, that there are more and more men who are wanting to redefine what fatherhood means in the wake of all this too. And that's where I see the positive, the optimism that I was talking about. So, I mean, that's the difficult part of the conversation, is on a socio-political level, it's undeniable that things are getting more and more messy. And I also believe that one of the things that I really enjoy about, ever since, and I'm forgetting her first name now, Alice Walker's daughter was one of the first in print to coin the phrase third wave feminism, when she stated, I think in Ms. Magazine, I am the third wave, and I may be misquoting that. But ever since then, reading the literature and perusing the different websites and things, what I'm inspired by is the notion that as these things start to break down, it's not just about men and women any more than it's about people with dark skin or people with light skin, or it's, you know, about people with abilities and people that don't have the same abilities. It becomes less and less about those dividing lines and a recognition that the way things are going right now benefits no one. And I think that people of all genders are starting to recognize that. And that's where I see the optimism. I see it in the way that women are starting to approach the issues in a different way. And I also see the way that men are starting to get involved in these types of conversations more and more. So as a father, with my daughter growing up in the world, I have to somehow believe that we're paving a path that's going to take us to a different place.
Well,
and
I have two grown sons. I mean, you know, being a parent does put you in a position of concern about the future, but I'm not terribly optimistic about what they're going to have to face in the future. Does that mean you shouldn't have become a parent? No, because, you know, this is an option that some people take. I mean, why would you assume that because you're a parent, you have to hope that the world is going to be great? You know, maybe when your kids are small, you don't want to really shock them with too much reality. At least that's our culture. You know, we protect our kids from reality. But the fact that you're a parent, I'm really giving you a hard time, Marcus.
No, it's absolutely
I'm
okay.
sorry.
I expected it to be tough, not from you.
But but the fact that you're a parent doesn't give you any special ability to predict a positive future. You know, you may want one more, but that doesn't mean that one is more likely to happen. There's something else that goes on. This
Can
is
I respond to that one
sure,
point, though, before we go on with that? Is that okay?
Sure.
I just want to respond to the
No,
one point.
no.
I don't think that what I'm stating is that I have the notion that I believe in a positive future, but I believe that I have to be working towards one.
Sure.
And that's the piece that becoming a parent lent to me, was not so much that I wanted to put on rose-colored glasses and paint a picture for my daughter that the world's a pretty place. We have a lot of conversations. She's 9 years old, and she understands a lot more about the world than I did at the age of 9. For me, it's about recognizing that I have an obligation to work towards a better future, even when I'm feeling pessimistic. So that's the difference.
No,
I agree with you about the
no,
pessimism.
that's true. It's being a parent is a tremendous. No, there is something about it that makes it harder to get off the hook. But you know, the perception of more sensitive men and what would the analog be for women? Competent?
Stronger, confident.
Stronger,
yeah.
okay. This experience is actually a privileged experience. It's probably less frequent than the consumption of organic food. It's about as frequent as being a vegan, I would say, demographically. But, you know, think about what it means to be a vegan. You have to be pretty privileged to be a vegan. If you live in a third world country where you can't get meat or dairy products, your veganness might lead you to malnutrition. So, there are a lot of things that are getting better for small numbers of people, and I think we should enjoy our lives as much as we can. It's kind of a waste not to. But that doesn't mean that the whole thing is getting better.
I absolutely agree.
That's all. We're not that far apart in our perceptions, but we should hear from them.
That sounds good.
Can men truly be feminists or active participants in the feminist movement, or merely bystanders, allies? Is there really a role for men in that movement?
You're asking me?
Either one of you.
Well, I think that men can, let me go first. Yes, I think men can be feminists. I even think men can be women if they want to. The only thing I think men can have it all, just like women, just we say, they can run corporations and have families and be sensitive and be strong and support women and support men and everything else. But there really is one thing that I don't think men should be permitted to do, and that is I don't think they should be permitted to hold the highest political office in any modern state. I think that's too dangerous. I think that's proven itself too dangerous an occupation for men.
I'd have to say, just in response to a little sidetrack, and again, I have this habit of like vaguely remembering things that I read or heard, so this may get corrected, and the email address is uomc@uoregon if you want to correct me later. But I think it was Ann Richards, the former governor of Texas, who one day walking out of a Senate session or out of a Congress session overheard a male congressman saying, well, women should never be allowed to run this country because we'd have a nuclear war every 28 days. And her response to the man who said it was actually, just as a little piece of education, the reason that you're referring to as far as the hormone levels changing, the one hormone that changes the most in women is testosterone, but it generally doesn't reach the level that men's testosterone levels are at every single day of their lives, which I thought was a really profound point. So I agree with you.
I mean, if you're a biological determinist.
Yes, well, I just found it to be interesting. But
it is. Look, to cut to the chase, I mean, a lot of people resist this idea, and what I normally hear is, well, why do you think women would do any better? And, isn't this sort of elitist or separatist? But, I think at a certain point, we have to accept things as they are. And so I would ask you to kind of perform a thought experiment, and that is, it's not Hillary Clinton instead of George Bush, it's Laura Bush instead of George Bush. Imagine Laura was our president instead of George. Do you think things would be the way they are now?
Sure.
You're not sure?
Not sure.
it's tricky.
Well, I'm
'cause
not sure. It's an empirical question.
We don't know.
We don't know.
Some question whether George Bush is even real.
He's real.
There has been a woman in charge through history.
Right.
It
No,
didn't
but
make any difference.
well, it didn't make any difference because they had to maintain themselves in the game as it was traditionally defined by men.
Power
Right.
is power.
Power is power. Well, you see, that's
very,
it. This is
very tempting when you have power to abuse,
well, I don't know. I mean,
regardless
there's
of the gender.
one concept is the idea of a critical mass. All right, let me give you another example. In Norway, by law, 40% of all members of parliament have to be women. And a study was recently conducted among Norway's political elites, and it was a study as to what they thought the different approaches were of men and women in politics among the most sophisticated politicians in the country. And what they said was men in politics tend to be interested in military issues, infrastructure, finance, and that was pretty much the what they were mostly interested in, whereas women are interested in more social issues like education, pension, health care, cultural issues, all right? So it's not because of testosterone or any of this, anything that's biologically determined. It's the historical roles. I mean, women have a different culture that does in all societies get passed on one way or another generationally, and they have different concerns. I mean, women are the ones who are choosing to work this second shift pretty much in every country in the world. So women are capable of both having power and maintaining an interest in things that are not that directly related to power. So it's an empirical question, whether women traditionally understood. Yeah.
I just wanted to go back to the comment about Bush and his wife, Laura. I don't really necessarily think that, it depends on like women and men having opinions. I think it has to do with class, that kind of stuff. It was Barbara Bush that said that, after the New Orleans Hurricane Katrina, it was like
That's right, they're better off.
They're better off, yeah.
Right.
So I don't necessarily think that just because you're a woman, you have better opinions. I think that it really depends on what your focus is and the people who
Well,
support
different
you.
interests. I mean, women traditionally have different interests, though, don't they?
Well, yeah, and then sometimes no. Like, I really don't care about getting married. I would like children maybe someday, but I really don't care about getting married. I was born into a matriarchal society. I'm Native American and was born where women were in control of the family home, the assets, the land. And so, like, I don't really necessarily see things the same way as mainstream American women. Like, the suffrage movement, it hindered the rights of Native American women instead of supporting them. Using Native American women's, reasoning behind rights and not supporting them because they were women of color. Like, I don't know.
Or refusing, I mean, there were many, my understanding is there were many pre-contact civilizations that were matriarchal among
they're still
indigenous
matriarchal
people.
and on the reservation.
But the European invaders refused to deal with the women. So,
That's true,
so
yeah.
they actually changed, in some cases, the gender structure of these societies. But, I mean, that would, no, they'd never change them? Not even the Iroquois?
Most of them stayed the same.
Well, it depends on whether you're doing government to government, but in the household and in the culture, the women still have the power.
What I think what you're speaking to, and to go back to the earlier question about can men be feminists, first of all, I'd like to say I sure hope so, because I believe myself to be one. So I use myself as an example, and I'm willing to have a conversation with anyone about that. So that's the best evidence I have. But as far as what you're saying in accordance with that too, is part of this third wave feminism that I interpret is that we are starting to break down and recognize that we're all different. And that's what this is really all about, that we all get to define ourselves in different ways, that it is no longer just simply about who's standing on which side of the fence. And the idea of there being separate cultures, even that is very tangible and real, and yet is completely constructed by us. And knowing that at least in part or largely it's a construction gives us the seeds of hope, because then we know we can reconstruct it. We can break it down, we can redefine it, and that's what I see the third wave and what's happening right now being, is people starting to challenge the very idea that there's a difference in the first place. And that opens the doorway.
But most Native Americans don't want to give up their cultures, right?
That's true, yeah.
Which I'm not sure necessarily the connection. Help me out.
Well, you're saying in a sense these are all social constructions that people can get over. And they are social constructions, but often people don't want to get over them.
Well, and I don't think it's a matter of getting, I don't see culture necessarily as being part of that social construction. I see the notion of division or separateness as being the social construction.
So culture isn't a social construction?
Well, no, I mean, it is technically, yes, absolutely. But I don't think that it means that we have to all become the same. I think that's the very point, is celebrating the difference and giving people the freedom, even with like 8, 9 years ago when we first started seeing the waves of the metrosexual movement sweeping across Europe and the East Coast, where men were starting to carry handbags, little things like that, where suddenly they were challenging the very stereotypes of what it meant to be a man out in public. And it was that opportunity to like step across that boundary or tease into the middle of that boundary a little bit and say, so what's wrong with me standing here? And the writings of third wave feminism, in my mind, are what's opened the doorway for a lot of that exploration.
Something we say in the union halls, the student union halls here at the University of Oregon, instead of unifying and making everyone the same, building alliances and agreeing to disagree and working together for the causes that are the same. I think that's,
Absolutely.
understanding that we're different, but working together to make it a stronger environment, building diversity so that, everybody can understand that, yeah, they're social constructs, but, we're individual people with individual cultures and needs while working for the same things.
Absolutely.
Okay, I have a question for you, Professor Sack. So by switching the gender structure in society, saying women holding the top political offices of state and not allowing men to do that, did you think it's possible that the same oppression that women have faced might occur within men?
I don't know. I mean, that's a possibility. The point is that I think that the whole Western technological project, and this is something that would have to happen in all Western democratic countries by vote, not by a violent revolution, more or less at the same time. As long as it's taking place in a democratic structure and it's come about democratically. I mean, the one thing that the women's movement has never produced has been women's political parties. That could happen. There's no reason to think that you'd have the same kind of oppression based on gender, because the oppression and the legacy of oppression based on gender goes back. It has many different historical layers that have to do with people's identities. So the answer to your question is twofold. It's an empirical question, whether women would then subtly oppress men in the way that women are still themselves oppressed in this society. I don't think so, but they might. In other words, it's an empirical question. It's not something you can have a strong position on theoretically. But I think what I'm interested in is less the internal dynamics in society and more the world trajectory, because the world trajectory is getting very dangerous. I mean, we seem to be on a path that really threatens our ability to survive on this planet, and I think that's the problem that I'm particularly interested in.
Now, by having women in the political offices, wouldn't you have to then kind of reboot every social structure, being that all the structures that are in place now historically have been put in place and run by men?
Not necessarily. Look, we have. I don't know if Hillary Clinton is going to get the nomination. I don't particularly like her. Does this have to go on camera? Is the camera off? It's on camera. I don't like her personally, but I will vote for her. And the reason I'll vote for her is I think that she's principled. She works very hard. And if you look at her interests, if you look at her signature interests, not the interests on the basis of which she competes politically with her opponents, but if you look at her own interests, she's consistently been interested in health care and children's issues and medical egalitarian medical issues, and from the little bit of empirical information we have, these are traditional women's issues. So that would be a change. I mean, what if Hillary Clinton or someone like her were president, and someone in Germany, and there was a woman in Germany. There is a woman in Germany now, and there was a woman in England. There is a woman in England. She's the Queen. She just came and visited us, even though she's not Prime Minister. What if you had a preponderance of women leading on the highest levels of state in all the democratic countries? You wouldn't have. I mean, I just don't think that there would necessarily be radical changes of structure, but there might be changes in focus. There might just be enough of a shift in focus that would sort of put us on a different path, you know, give us some different interests. I mean, it's very strange. The second shift phenomenon is very strange. What's also strange is the solution to it is not to pay women for being mothers, because that commodifies something that really we want to keep outside of the system of commodities. But that doesn't mean that you can ignore the fact that there's all this extra work. So one of the things we have to have is more respect for those things that can't have prices. So I think there could be a subtle shift in priorities. And, you know, cultures have interests. Cultures have characters. Cultures have fashions. And for a very long time, all of the human virtues have been aligned with fairly aggressive male virtues to a large extent. Maybe it's time, you know, from the top down there could be a shift. Does that seem totally bizarre to you?
No, so just to kind of clarify what you're saying, it really doesn't matter the system in which the women are working in, but shifting the aims versus the system. So working within
Well,
the
it's an
system.
interesting question. I haven't thought that much about the system. I'm assuming it would be a democratic system, but, you know, it probably has to be a democratic system, loosely understood, because a totalitarian system it tends not to produce in the long run constructive aims. So in order to have constructive aims that respond to the needs of those governed, you know, we need the social contract, and it's going to be something of like a democratic system, yeah. So I'm not suggesting that suggesting that what's necessary are deep structural changes. I'm just suggesting that if you have radically different types of individuals in positions of ultimate power, that would be an experiment worth making.
Can I also respond to that too?
What do you think about that?
Well, I think that it's interesting because for me, I have to back up a little bit, and I have to question whether we're living in denial as a culture, believing that we're actually living in democracy in the first place. The last two presidential elections show that real tangibly that may not be the case. But on top of that, there are a lot of people who believe.
Midterm election, though.
To a lot of people, though, they also believe that this country and most of Western civilization is actually run by corporations. So perhaps women becoming CEOs may have more of an impact on the way things happen than women becoming presidents. So that's one thing that comes to mind for me, is really questioning the whole political system and the power it actually has.
What the head of state really is.
Really
whether
means.
it's a president
Or a puppet, essentially.
Okay,
You know.
well, let's say for the sake of argument that the head of state is actually the president. Maybe it's not, but if it were, do you think things would shift if women were president?
I think absolutely. I think there's no limit right now to our need for having more voices of women in guiding our country and our policies. No doubt at all. I just don't know whether or not Hillary Clinton or anyone else who's a woman becoming the president is going to have that big of an impact. I think that part of, I question whether or not the president has that much influence over the way our policies run.
But say the top leadership level in different countries and in different areas. So you may very well be right. I mean, maybe it's not just the presidency of the United States, but of Halliburton or various
Absolutely,
other.
absolutely, and I would not argue against that at all. I think that, and the other piece that I wanted to add too about the second shift, it's come up a couple different times, and I think there is another possible solution or part of a solution. There's no easy answer to any of this. But part of it would be for men to start redefining fatherhood and take on the responsibilities and the joys that go along with the responsibilities of the second shift. If men become more involved in home life and in raising children, then it's sharing the responsibilities of the economic pressures that have led so many women into the workforce.
Well, you know, there have been studies. I mean, women have been working outside the home in highly committed ways for several decades, and men have paid lip service to sharing the housework, women's work.
Not
but
all
no,
men.
you might
Not
be
all
in,
men.
no, but okay. I mean, they've said this would be a good thing, but the statistics again and again show that women are still doing a disproportionate amount of this women's work.
Absolutely. And I think the only way that will change.
So why would it change? I mean, why would men suddenly decide that they want to do this?
because I think that many men are starting to recognize more and more that it's not just a burden to raise their children. Many men, for generation after generation, have realized that they don't know their own kids. And they're realizing that they've actually lost something in this myth of the man going out to work and coming home. There's something lost there too. And my father doesn't know me very well, you know, and his father definitely didn't know him very well. But generation after generation, men are becoming more interested in actually knowing their kids and being a part of their lives. And the more men start to become involved in it, it's not just to relieve the pressure off of women, it's to liberate ourselves as men from the burdens of trying to live up to those rules. And I think that that's part of what happens with these gender roles is men are trapped as well. That's part of why men kill themselves 6 times more often than women, is because all the rules say if you're depressed, you never admit you're lost. And so there's men walking around like time bombs. 58 school killings in America in the last 15 years. One of them was a female that pulled the trigger. The headlines after that were girls out of control. The other 57 that were pulled by boys never mentioned the fact that they were boys. You know, there's time bombs walking around everywhere that are finally starting to recognize that it's not good for them. We're dying sooner of all 20 of the leading causes of death. You know, it's not healthy to be a man in this culture right now.
I know, but don't you think the construction of masculinity is such that it's inherently risky? That part of being a man, as it's traditionally understood, is that ability to do dangerous things?
And I think most men are starting to say that it's not worth it. I think that yes, there is a construction.
Most men?
I think a lot of men are starting to question a lot more than I believe we're doing it 5 years ago when I first started getting involved with this work in a campus community. I've been involved in grassroots organizations where I'm surrounded by men doing this work. Right. Coming to campus, that was a part of it that was really hard for me, was coming back as a non-traditional student and immersing myself in a more conventional culture where it was really difficult for me because I felt like I wasn't going to be able to find the same population of men. In 5 years, I've seen that population grow.
But what's the data? I mean, what's the hard data? What percentage of men who would otherwise have traditional male identities are giving up those identities because they think they can be happier without them?
Well, there's no way to measure that shift.
Sure there is. There's surveys, you know, there are all kinds of surveys.
Well, the best way that I could measure it would be the attendance in groups like the Myths of Masculinity here on campus. That we started out the group 5 years ago as an opportunity for men and people of all genders to come and discuss these gender role stereotypes and what it means to try to live up to be a man, and is it working, and if not, how is it not?
How many men?
The numbers have continued to increase
So
to the point where
they?
we're only averaging at this point about between 8 and 12 people every week. So it's not an impressive number. It's a discussion group.
Right.
And 5 years ago, we had a hard time getting anyone but the co-facilitators in the room. So again, I have to, for my own makeup, my own way that I'm constructed internally that has nothing to do with socialization, believe that that's progress and keep working on it.
Oh, it is progress. I just wonder, you know, if it's enough, fast enough.
I'm not sure. I've been living, as part of being born in the 1960s, I've been living with the looming fear that the world was going to end tomorrow my entire life. I may get to 120 and realize that it never actually happened. So I don't want to get caught up too much in that when I know that the real work is reaching out to the men that are standing in front of me. And that doesn't exclude the idea of working on the political level and the larger change, but the real work for me is working with the people right in front of me and helping them to understand that they don't have to play by the rules, that it may actually hurt them to continue playing by the rules. And I think there are a lot of men that are realizing they're missing out on large portions of experience by trying to do just that.
But there are 20,000 people of both sexes on this campus. About 10,000 of them are men, and you're getting 8 or 10 a week. What would it take to get, say, 1,000 a week? Then that would be right as far as movements go. That would be what do you think? How could you do that?
To be quite honest, I don't know.
Yeah, they're still college students.
You won't get 1,000 people together on this campus. It's too niche oriented.
I like to believe, and I know that this falls into the realm of what we were talking about in terms of optimism and pessimism, and this reveals a lot about my level of optimism, is I like to believe in the 100th monkey concept. The idea that really there
Rupert
is a point of
Sheldrake,
critical
right.
mass where when that 100th monkey, so to speak, finally gets it, the change will accelerate.
You know where that
Well,
comes from?
From research in the South Pacific, isn't
Well,
it?
it's the research is questionable. The phenomenon is, the claim is that there are these islands that monkeys live on where they eat sweet potatoes and coconuts, but they don't have any contact with each other. And if you teach the monkeys on one island and then the next island and the next island, a critical number of these islands to say wash their sweet potatoes or their coconuts before eating them, then the monkeys on the islands further away with whom they've had no contact will all of a sudden start washing their food. Nobody knows how. It's called formative causation. It's a little shaky in terms of what's accepted in
I
the
have
sciences.
to believe it.
Okay. I know, but you want something more than, an article of faith. I mean, I'm sure there are things that would get more men coming to a men's group. I'm not certain what they are. I have no idea what they are, unless you made it a requirement,
Well, and it's interesting you
campus.
say that, because one of the most successful groups we run is a curriculum that I helped write 2 years ago. It's the Mad Skills program. And the Mad Skills program is designed for younger men who get in trouble on college campuses, and they're mandated to go to these courses that are all about help seeking and all about socialization of gender and the impact of it. And in those groups, what I've discovered is every single man comes in there mandated, and I can't even tell you how big the chips on people's shoulders are. Every one of them has a story about how they shouldn't be there, how it's unjust that they have to sit in the room and talk about this. And within one session of the 5 sessions that we run, they're all opening up a whole bunch more. By the second session, they're all talking about how much they appreciate having the opportunity to talk about things. One person in the very first session 2 years ago said, "I never realized I had so much to say about this until I was given a place to say it." By the end of the 5th session, every single evaluation we've got from the men who have participated say that it was worth it, and had they known, they would have done it voluntarily.
I know
So-
how you could get more men to
All
come.
right,
You
tell
could
me.
lobby for a couple of rules that almost all the men on campus can't help but break.
There you go.
Okay.
There you go.
Get those rules in place. and
Get
you'll
a flood of people coming.
You'll funnel them all
Well,
into your
one
groups.
hopeful thing that I will throw
No.
in about Mad Skills that is also a sign of hope again is that in the current session that's running, and it's the first one that I'm not facilitating, so I actually get to go home and spend time with my daughter while someone else is running my group. In this current session, we have had 4 drop-ins that have shown up to take it without being mandated. So that's 4 men, but that's 4 more than we've ever had before. That have shown up hearing about it and said, "I'd be interested in this course." And they're not being sent mandated. They're sitting down next to men who are there because they got in trouble, but they want to talk about these things. So we're looking at expanding it now to run it twice per term instead of once, so that we can have an entire session open up. We're having to get bigger rooms, and we're having a lot of men express an interest in participation. So I would have a very difficult time doing my job if I didn't believe in these baby steps. But I absolutely agree with you that they are still just baby steps, and the possibility of things going awry are huge and growing.
We have more questions. People are dying to ask questions.
It's shifting gears a little bit, but I'm curious to know if either of you think the nature-culture division generally associates women with nature, female with nature, Mother Earth, and culture with the masculine, will persist in a third wave feminism.
You want me to do this?
If you'd like to,
Sure.
I could.
The idea of a nature-culture division whereby women are associated with nature is a critical tool that some feminists use in order to criticize and correct a number of texts and also settled roles in society that women seem to have. I don't find it at this stage of the game a very interesting critical tool. because I think that we're all sort of, in fact, just about as equally artificial as not. You know, the main difference between the kinds of work that women do in the family versus the kinds of work that men do, it's not so much an artificial and natural division at this point. It's a question of labor intensiveness. I mean, the kinds of work that women do in the family takes more time. So maybe at some point in the beginnings of modernity, women were associated with nature and the earth and forces that were less technological or required less education. But I don't think that's. I just don't think that. I don't find that useful now. Marcus might.
No, I don't know if I necessarily find it useful, but at the end of your question, you asked, in third wave feminism, will the division persist or the association persist? And I think, no. I think that just like anything else, the divisions are that's what's being broken down, are the divisions and the associations that maintain the divisions. So that, just like every other division and association that we're currently living under or believing is real, is now being critically dismantled. So my belief, again, would be that in the third wave feminism, in the current generation that's happening, that's going to be deconstructed to some degree as well.
In reality or in theory?
Well, tell me what you mean by the difference. I mean, what do you mean in terms of that question?
Well, in reality would be if people's thinking about males and females radically changed to the point where I think what you're talking, you see, what I find problematic is I think you have a good idea of how things should be. And it's a plausible ideal of how things should. There might be other ideals of how things should be, but that's a plausible ideal. But I don't think you can go from an ideal of how things should be to a description of how things are.
No,
you know,
but I think that
I'm not just asserting a distinction between is and ought. What I'm saying is that how we want things to be, even though in a small way we're making them happen as much as we can, is not the same thing as how they might in reality be.
I absolutely agree.
That's what
I absolutely agree.
What I find
I think
a little
I think that a lot of what we call reality is the product of our collective conversations. So I agree with you, and I think that this conversation and conversations like this and the process of dismantling those associations.
See, it's like a bear. You reason it's like a bear trap. You know, it always snaps shut on the same point, and that is that what we're doing now, that what we people of goodwill are doing now here in this room is changing the world. And I would like to see some evidence for that, other than the fact that wouldn't it be nice if it were so? That's all.
Well, like I said to the question earlier, can men be feminist? I feel like I'm living proof
I think men can be feminists.
that it can be different. So, and I'm just saying that I don't know, I'm not a professor in this area, so I don't have like evidence to back it up. I don't have all the background. I have myself as evidence to show that I am a part of reality, a microcosm of what's going on, and I am different than I was before through the effort of having these conversations and citing these conversations.
So therefore everybody could be different.
I believe that we're constantly changing, and I believe that conversations like this foster that.
Just to throw in my 2 cents, I think this is what I'm getting at, is that you're talking about your own world and people's world around you, and you're talking about the whole world as like 6 billion people. And I don't think that, you know, people in small groups here in Oregon can change people over in China's worlds. Like, that's kind of an impossible task, but if you can change your own world here in your own community, isn't that like a positive step towards the right direction?
Well, yes, absolutely. You know,
Get all kinds of response.
But it's think globally, act locally, right? So you act locally, you change your own world. And, you know, obviously I try to change my own world as much as I can, but I also take the responsibility of being a theorist who's thinking about the whole thing. Now, if there's a place for that, then I think we need to do that. And why do we need to do that? What good is going to? I don't know.
So it's not necessarily wrong to think that, you know, you're doing good. You're still
Yeah,
going in a
but
positive way when you're
absolutely.
changing your world.
Absolutely, you're doing good when you're changing your world, but I think it's important to keep the perspective and not think that in changing your world, you're changing the whole world. And you can make this, and the same mistake can be made in the other direction, that when you think about the problems in the whole world, you don't want to lose the ability to enjoy your life, if your life could be enjoyable. But they're different, you see, they're different things. You're absolutely right, though. I think you put your finger on the sense in which we're talking about different things.
But, and I would actually state that I don't think we're talking about different things, but that's the great thing is we can disagree. That I think the butterfly effect is real, that I think that it's not just a concept, it's been proven empirically over and over again. And the butterfly effect essentially, in a nutshell, states that one small deviation or variation in the input can completely radically change the output. So we're completely altering and deviating the input right here by having a conversation that is outside the realm of what normally people are talking about. So whether or not that has an impact on people living on the other side of the planet, I don't know if it will. I know that it can, and that's been empirically proven.
Remember, before we were talking about coming from back east, and I said once you've lived in Oregon for a certain amount of time, you can't really live in one of these major cities back east. And really, I don't think you could go back east again.
No.
That is a very West Coast approach to reality. The butterfly effect. I hate to be the but the butterfly effect is very small. A butterfly flapping its wings somewhere in China might, of course it's going to have an effect. Every cause has an effect. In the physical universe, there's like a continuous causal chain of events. Nothing really disappears. But I don't think that's enough to cause a tsunami.
Well, again, I think this is where I think we're actually saying the same thing but disagreeing. I think that empirical evidence has shown that it actually could cause a tsunami, and that really, for me, it seems like there's nothing more noble than creating the change that we can create in the lives that we're living. That's the impact that we can have as an individual person in the world. Yes, we can work on the political things and absolutely have to. It's a fundamental need to get out and work on the bigger issues. But the best way for us to work on the bigger issues is to address the way we live our daily lives.
I'm going to interject because I know we're just about out of time, and I want to mention a program that we have going in university housing, and I don't know whether this will agree or disagree with our panelists tonight, but it does talk about changing the world that you live in locally, hoping to have a more global impact. And so maybe if Jeff could help hand some of these things out. I'm going to keep one of them, actually. I'm going to mention briefly our Count Me In campaign that we have going in university housing that is starting to expand across the campus. And what I'm handing out is our pledge card, a resource card, and then a card that you can actually sign should you want to join and participate in the program. But the pledge is designed, and I'll read it first, then I'll explain it. The pledge says, I promise to stand against intolerant behavior, to not ignore any form of discrimination, and to show our world that I will not accept a place where anyone is made to feel unwelcome. I pledge to become a beacon of hope for those who experience the pain of discrimination, and my speech and actions will model this to the community around me. I desire a society in which everyone is welcomed and accepted. Embracing everyone's humanity is vital to building respectful, positive, and inclusive communities. And if this is a pledge that you want to sign, just sign this card and return that to me. If you don't want to, please feel free to leave them or recycle them. Tonight is an interesting conversation on issues of gender, issues of race, issues of culture. And so I think that this pledge is appropriate to bring up at this time, just in talking about the fact that we all have the ability in our daily interactions to make a difference with one person, one small community. And by building a critical mass with this program, hopefully we can build a movement that will be a little bit more inclusive, a little bit more impactful. So there's an opportunity for you to participate in this and commit yourself to making that change one person at a time, hoping to have that larger global impact. So maybe that falls in between the two of you right there in terms of the local action, perhaps the global impact, and maybe not picking sides on that one. So feel free to take a look at the pledge. Again, if you don't want the card, please leave it. We would love to reuse it. I would encourage you to take the resource cards here. They're great resources for you. Should you be in need of in a situation where you may need some assistance or support, great list of resources to have. And if you sign the pledge card, please return that. We do keep those. We want to see what our numbers are looking like and how big an impact this program is having and how many people have committed themselves to that. So I will now pass things off to Jeff.
All right, and as we're wrapping up, I just wanted to remind everybody about the book giveaway we have going on, and Kevin is passing out the pieces of paper for that. And I'd just like to thank our panelists for giving us a very stimulating discussion. It was very entertaining and informative. So if we give them a round of applause. And thank you guys for all coming tonight.
Thank you.
And we'll draw the winner in a second.